It's a knob. How about now? No? Any better? Hello? Hello? Still not? I don't want to blast your ears. How about now? Still not. Still. Is it working? Can you hear it? No? It is on, so hopefully you can hear me. Can everybody see me? Can everybody hear me? It's a Harry Potter line. Anybody catch it? Well, good morning. I want to get on to the Susan Wolf article, but the first thing I thought we should double quick check on is the quiz question. Some of you had the answer correct according to the artist. Of course, the artist isn't the only authority on what he made. The question being, what is that art piece that's sitting out in the lobby? It occurred to me to ask you that because, of course, you're all sitting out there prior to class, and I'm thinking, gosh, you ought to know what you're sitting next to. Frequently, they have special events out in that lobby area, and they have like a book signing, and the author from New York or wherever she is sitting on a couch right next to that. And I'm sure they don't explain to him or her or it, what this is. It just seems, and of course all the pictures taken of the artist, even those that like show up in the paper, are going to be with that sitting right there. And it's just one of those weird things that it bothers me that people don't know what they're sitting next to. So I like to bring that up so that at least you're familiar with the story of that. Background to that was that one of the students in the art department made an 8-foot or more paper mache male organ of the same kind of pairing, right? And the one that he had made was sitting on display in the spine where the student, the hallway down where all the restaurants are and everything. And it was very, very obvious. Everyone that would walk by it would say, hey, that's an erect penis. And it was huge, so it was pretty obvious. Everyone could recognize it. But the one day, they had a couple of busloads of young grammar school children due to come through for some sort of presentation in that same area. And the officers in the area decided, the student officers decided to move it so that it would avoid problems. And so they moved it into one of the other offices instead of sitting out in the hallway. And as a result of that, the artist complained and the ACLU got involved, right? And literally sued concerning his freedom of expression being infringed by their action. I don't remember how it worked out, but the odd thing in my mind is the female opposite of that has been sitting there in the lobby all these years. That was from the 90s, I think. And it doesn't seem like anyone recognizes it. That's weird. Some of you recognized it right away. Sorry about that. Yes. I hope you didn't find, well, I guess it's up to you to find it offensive or not. In any case, that's why that's there. I was thinking for a quiz question for today, the other piece of art that's pretty significant, it's not inside, but it's out on the lawn. Are you all familiar with the art that's sitting out on the lawn? You pass it, I'm sure, each morning you come to class. Um, it's by Dennis Oppenheim, and it's called Image Intervention. Have I shown you that already? That's it up here on the left, right? I'll recognize it as that pile of art that's out there on the lot. So the quiz question I have for you is, does your sense of the meaning of life affect how you interpret art? Can you hear me? Is this working now? Yes? No? I raised the hand even more. Too many knobs. So does your sense of the meaning of life affect how you interpret art? Today I think we've, not everyone of course, when we look at Susan Wolf and we talk about the meaning of lives and things of that sort, I'm sure you got the impression, and this is probably something everyone growing up here already senses, and that is that there are lots of different interpretations, lots of different ethnic, cultural groups that interpret the meaning of life differently. And you have your choice. By growing up in the United States, it's an imperative that you become a heretic. It's kind of an odd sort of thing. What is a heretic? A heretic is someone who believes they have their own choice. And by growing up in the United States, you're taught that it's your free choice what you believe to be true, which means that you're a heretic as soon as you accept that. So you get to make your own choice. There, of course, years ago, various religious groups would have persecuted you for even thinking that you had the free choice. And by the way, certainly some groups would still persecute you today if you think you have the right to choose for yourself what you believe. And as a result, in the United States, there are lots and lots of different kinds of beliefs in what the meaning of life might be. Despite her argument that it's a nonsense question, she does agree, of course, that there are plenty of people that absolutely believe that there are meanings in their life, or meaning in their life, right? And so you end up with lots of people having lots of beliefs, and some of the result of that is what I think of as the museum effect, and that is that we begin thinking of the various kinds of meanings of lives associated with the kinds of cultures that have them as panoramas in a museum, where you, like our Natural History Museum downtown, if you've ever been in it, you remember that they used to have panoramas. I don't remember if they still have them there, but there's a lot of displays still. The Smithsonian exhibit especially displays various cultural groups and shows how they live, what sort of things they do in order to survive. And all of those are kind of displayed as something interesting for us to walk along and look at them. And it's not like you're looking at them to think, gee, which one is true? Which one is correct? How should I live? By this one or this one? You're looking at it for historical interest, not for cultural persuasion, basically. And in a sense, I think that's the way we're inspired by our culture, our high culture, if you want to call it that, to interpret all ethnic cultures and meanings as literally historical entities that are sociologically attuned to a particular environment at a particular time and likely to evolve and become something else. And if that's the case, that gives you the impression that none of those religions, none of those meta-narratives are true. They're instead historically, sociologically, evolutionarily based on a particular situation in a particular time, and evolved and developed by men, as opposed to something divine, for example. And if you come to that belief, and you have that kind of museum attitude towards those beliefs, you essentially end up believing that no meaning, no meta-narrative, we might call it, no story that explains why you're here is true. They're man-made interpretations. So the question, does your interpretation or your sense of the meaning of life inspire your interpretation of art? And I would think that, of course, that is certainly true. So if we're looking at a medieval church in Paris, and we're looking at the art there, we're not inspired to love Mary, the Mother of God, because of the beautiful artwork. We're instead thinking in terms of, boy, in the 1300s, they really had their lead dyeing technique down pretty well, because the color is still so vivid in the sunlight, right? You know, so you're appreciating it for its historical aspects, as opposed to finding it incredibly influencing your sense of the divine. Would that be the case, you think? Is that fun? Is philosophy fun for you, or is that just absolutely annoying at anybody? Remember, that's the asshole part of all of that. Speaking of assholes, we didn't really do very much with Socrates. Let me go back to the most famous asshole. Do you think he was charged with being impious? Why? Why was he charged with being impious? Anybody have their favorite guess from reading the Apology? What did you think? Anybody feel like saying anything? He was ugly, that's for sure. I'm trying to look relatively similar, although it's not the appropriate weather to wear the kind of clothing that the Greeks would wear at that time, sandals especially. Bare feet, he used to wear bare feet. I don't know if you could wear bare feet, because it just means you're not wearing anything. By the way, if you, yes?
I used to not wear shoes.
Yeah, well, yeah. But would you say you were wearing bare feet? Were you wearing bare feet? This is still not loud enough, is it?
Like, bare? Girl?
No, bare is in no.
Oh yeah, no socks, no shoes. Just walk around with snow and stuff. I have no release. You know what? I'm gonna stop talking. I'm lost.
The more you guys talk, the less I have to. And I still get paid, which is fine. Actually, my wife gets all the money. That's our deal. She gets all the money, and I get to live there, which is kind of neat. 46 years worth. Wow. Ooh. And she still lets me live there. Amazing. Okay, so if you're familiar with the Apology, hopefully, remember the reason I have the syllabus is so that prior to class you read the articles that are listed there, and hopefully also look at the videos that I might have links to. Some of them I think, especially when we get down, I think it was Mark's, for some reason, that BBC video is no longer there, but I could find others to replace that. Or you could always just Google Marx, M-A-R-X, right, Karl, and look for videos on Karl Marx. Hopefully you'll find the videos at least as interesting as the readings. But if we look at the Apology, a very famous, I think I started talking about it, ooh, wrong button. Let's go the other way. So his friend Chaerephon goes to Delphi and asks the priestess, is anyone smarter, or wiser rather, than Socrates? And the priestess famously says, no. Kind of weird. Remember, they're kind of asphyxiated by the gases, so that they're famous for responding in a way that no one could quite figure out what it is. One of the more famous ones was the general asked, will he win if he goes into battle? And the priestess said, a great army will be destroyed that day. And he thought, yes, I'm going to win. And of course it was actually his army that was destroyed, not right. Okay. So it's ambiguous on purpose, probably. But so Chaerephon comes back and tells Socrates that the god, and this is the voice of Apollo, right? And Apollo literally means of or from reason, logos, right? APO is from, logos is reason. So Apollo is literally one of his issues. He's the sun god, he's a snake god, but he's also the god of reason. And in that sense, he's the defense that Socrates has, because the reason he's such an asshole, he feels. Does it bother you when I say that word? Or is that funny? I can say, use the philosopher. That's a synonym, but, a little bit different. In any case, right, it's supposed to be funny. Thanks for at least laughing. However, he's absolutely amused by this. Wait, there's no possible way that the god thinks that I'm the wisest. That's just no way. Imagine if the god said, you're the wisest. You would think, that's silly. So he wants to go out and prove it. So he starts asking those who are considered to be the wise all these hard questions, like what is virtue, what is the good, what is love, these definitional questions, which I think I already mentioned. Eric Havelock argues was a turning point in the way these kinds of things began to be thought of. Prior to that, through poetry, usually the individuals that are in the poem are acting out the virtue, and so the people listening to the poem are getting a very concrete image of what these virtues are. But thanks to the switch from poetry to prose, remember the title of Eric Havelock's book is The Muse Learns to Write, right? You end up with the ability to have these terms as abstract concepts, so that instead of thinking of individual concrete virtuous efforts that a hero might make, instead you begin asking, well, what is goodness in general, right? What is bravery in general, right? So it becomes more abstract. And so it's, of course, much more difficult. So when Socrates begins asking these kinds of questions, people give these concrete answers, and then he asks further questions about it, the Socratic method, right? And as he's asking these questions, their answers get turned around, so that eventually they end up looking very foolish, because they're basically criticizing their own opinion that they started with. It eventually even looks like a contradiction. And at that point, Socrates closes the chapter basically and points out, well, but earlier you said just the opposite. And everybody laughs at this wise person, which totally pisses that person off. Especially if this is typically in a home where they're having dinner and wine, kind of a symposium, right, which is bread and then wine, very much like the Christian Mass, for example. And that's when they're having their conversations. And by the way, they often are drunk by the time they get to these kinds of climactic discussions. Yes. So that's kind of part of the picture, right? So these can be very interesting dialogues. And when this happens, of course, not only are the people that are insulted by his demonstrating that they're stupid, basically, upset with him, but the people that have paid that person to teach their youth are upset because here he's demonstrating that the teacher that they paid a lot of money for, generally, have clearly been bested by this bum off the street. That's really irritating. So that seems to be one of the main reasons that he's considered impious, because he's annoyed everybody, right? There's another interesting aspect to this, depending on who you read. Bettany Hughes is kind of interesting. There's also another book titled The Trial of Socrates by I.F. Stone. Either one. That looks pretty old. Interesting. Stone was a reporter. When he retired, he decided to spend the rest of his life learning Greek, reading the ancient philosophers, and beginning from there, spending the rest of his life going over the history of philosophy. He learned enough Greek to study the Apology and then died. So that's kind of a shame. But so, look this up. But basically, I.F. Stone argued that the real reason that people were upset with him was because he was associated with the 30 tyrants that the Spartans had put in charge of Athens after they beat Athens in the Peloponnesian War. And these were 30 rich folks that included, by the way, relatives of Plato. And remember, Athens was a democracy, and once Spartan whooped them in battle, they replaced the democratic government with 30 individuals that they hand-selected. But within a period of time, the Athenians managed to kill all 30 of them and replace their government with another democracy, right? But the concern they had was that there were lots of others associated with those tyrants, and they wanted to make sure they cleaned the whole house to get rid of them. And Socrates, at one point, had been ordered by them to go and arrest someone who had fled Athens to bring him back for punishment. And Socrates didn't do it. And then after his refusal, it was amazing that the tyrants didn't kill Socrates. So everyone figured Socrates must have been a favorite of the tyrants. And so politically, it looked to many that Socrates was associated with those 30 tyrants and therefore might deserve to be punished because of that association. So there's another possibility there. There's also the defense that Socrates himself brings up from Aristophanes' play, where Aristophanes depicts Socrates in the play The Clouds. And remember, Aristophanes' best show is hilarious. And in The Clouds, I think of it as very similar to the Monty Python in their kind of humor. Absolutely slapstick. They have Socrates being carried around on a pallet up in the air, and he's kind of drunk, and he's saying things like, "I'm flying," as he's going around. You know, so basically, not only an asshole, but an idiot as well, right? And of course, he's depicted as having a bad influence on young boys, especially in his dark hole of a little school, etc. But none of this apparently was the case. Socrates points out that this has colored everybody's impression of him because they've seen this play, and so they think that's actually him, but it's not. And he asks around, how many of you who know me know that that's not me? And Plato's one of the ones there in the trial that literally apparently agrees that that's not Socrates at all, right? So he has to defend himself against the prior conceptions that everybody has of him. In any case, his defense, what do you think? Was he guilty of being impious? The answer is, well, he was found guilty, right? So yes, they found him impious. What does it mean to be impious? Kind of interesting. We already have a dialogue where Socrates has to ask what piety is, and that's the euthyphro, which the way euthyphro, EU is the prefix that means good. THY is theo, or God, and phro, PHRO, is phronesis, or analysis. So you basically have the word meaning good God analysis. Right? So euthyphro is a character who is a priest, and so therefore a specialist on the gods. And they're in line, Socrates behind Euthyphro, waiting for their trials to begin. And he asks Euthyphro, "Why are you here?" And Euthyphro explains that his father had inadvertently killed his slave, Euthyphro's slave, and he wanted to put his father on trial for murder. You could tell just from the way Socrates reacts to that he doesn't think that's a good idea. But since he's already met Euthyphro now, and he realizes that Euthyphro is a priest, and he, by the way, is going to be on trial for being impious, he would like to ask Euthyphro if Euthyphro could teach him how to be pious, because he's a specialist on that. And Euthyphro feels, oh, certainly, I'll be glad to help, right? So Socrates begins by asking one of those definitional questions, what is piety? And Euthyphro responds, being pious is doing what the gods love. And how many gods do the Greeks have? Plenty, right? They have a pantheon, right? You know, the pan means all, theon, the gods. So you have the whole thing, all the gods, right? Lots of them. And by the way, they're all very humanistic or anthropomorphic, right? You know, so they're just like us. They have fights, arguments. Zeus is famous for not being very good with regard to his marriage. In fact, he loves to fool around with practically everyone. As you know, painters, for example, have to paint Zeus as a swan or a bull. imagine artists having to depict Leda and this. I didn't get it right. So there's lots of paintings of Zeus disguised as a swan, mating with Leda, etc. Not Hera was his wife, right? Hera is in charge of order, and Zeus is just a pain in the butt, right? So when Euthyphro says doing what the gods love is how you should be pious, Socrates brings up a very basic problem, and that is, well, if I do what Zeus loves, I'm going to be in trouble with Hera. If I do what Hera loves, Zeus will think I'm no man at all, right? So how can you be pious to both of them? It seems like if you're pious to the one, you're impious to the other, etc. And that's just the one particular example. You can think of Bacchus and Apollo as other examples of that, right? Apollo is the god of reason. Bacchus is the one you celebrate with wine and basically goes bananas, right? In any case, Euthyphro is totally frustrated with this turn of events because it hasn't worked out very well. His concrete explanations of this abstract concept are in conflict with one another. How can all of these various concrete explanations make sense in one abstract concept? They don't. And so he's frustrated, doesn't know where to go from there. So Socrates poses another question for him that he thinks will help him, and that's the question, is the pious pious because the gods love it? Or do the gods love the pious because it's so pious? You see how that works? Which comes first? The gods' own preferences, whatever they like, well, that's what we're supposed to like too, right? Or is it that the pious is something that is absolutely something that we can imagine, we can figure out what it is, and that's what we're really trying to do, is be pious, regardless of whether the gods love it or not. And this has political implications, because if you're a member of a religion where the priest tells you what you should believe, then you should believe what the priest tells you. But if the priest tells you to believe something and you think that can't be right, what are you doing? You're trying to use reason to figure out what is real piety, and this priest is not doing such a good job, right? In other words, you're undercutting the religion, and that's precisely, I think, what Socrates is doing. He's looking for that abstract concept, and at the time, the priesthood is very concrete and not really very coherent. And so his criticism of them literally gets him in trouble with everyone. And so they find Socrates guilty and punish him, as you saw with the Steve Martin sketch with the hemlock. But ever since, we think of Socrates as sort of the patron saint of critical thinking. By the way, the one dialogue is the krito, which is, notice, the same word as critical, right? So when you look at the various dialogues, you can think each of those words essentially means what the dialogue is about, even though it's also the name of a character, and apparently really the name of a character, like Parmenides, for example. Okay. Any questions on Socrates at this point? We're going to go back to Plato on occasion. Notice that in following this text and scooting around from various articles, we're getting an overall look at lots of different philosophical issues instead of following, say, a historical trek through the history of philosophy, which takes quite a long time. I think it makes more sense to do that in several semesters instead of just one. Okay. So, I should mention when we're talking about translation, notice that all of Plato's works, of course, are in Greek. So if you're trying to figure out what did Plato really say, what does he really mean, we're of course trying to look at English versions of it, perhaps, or maybe German, if you're German, etc. You could, of course, study Greek, which is a requirement for most PhD programs. If you're going to study the Greek philosophers, you have to be able to study them in their original. And of course, there's lots of problems with ancient Greek. When we think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, one of the things is that they only have 3 colors, black, white, and red, which results in some really odd things, like them referring to the wine-dark sea, which, if you've ever seen the ocean, doesn't look like wine. So all sorts of interesting problems result from that, including the question, did their eyes not see the same amount of colors that we see today? And of course that seems absolutely ridiculous, because evolution takes a lot longer than that. So the argument is, no, they must have seen the colors, they just didn't notice them because they didn't have the concepts for it. So the argument then is that, well, if your language doesn't have the concepts, you don't have the idea. You're not going to recognize it, etc. So that's pretty interesting to get into that and think about the differences between various languages and the way they do colors, and virtually anything else, actually. For example, French. Everything in French is sexed. If it starts with le, it's male, and if it starts with la, it's female. And all of the nouns are one or the other, which is very strange. La chaise, why is a chair feminine? Or le chaise. Actually, my French is terrible, sorry. I had just French in college, and it was enough, though. I managed to take enough to pass my graduate test in it. And the Army also thought I spoke French well enough to be a French linguist, but frankly, when I hear French being spoken, I'm as confused as anybody. It's just weird. It does help me, though, when a Frenchman is saying something in English, because I can figure out through his accent what his English words are. That helps. Sorry. Okay, that's just fine. Okay, Susan Wolf. I've already started by talking a little, so with the apology, one of the things I did one Christmas break was I tried doing my own version of it. You could do that yourself by going online to the Perseus Project, which is absolutely cool. The Perseus Project has a tremendous amount of the ancient texts in the original in Greek and English translations to go with it, and you can click on words individually to see what they mean, so you can puzzle out how the translations would work out. Very significant differences from one translation to another. For example, here's one of the interesting problems. When English scholars first started translating Greek texts into English, it was about the time of Thomas Hobbes. Also, by the way, the time of the King James version of the Bible, right? Which is the same concern, is we need the text translated into the language that the people can read it, right? And so when they were translating the Greek text, one of the things that they obviously did was they wanted the nobles who were going to be reading the English text to be inspired by the Greek philosophers. And so they cleaned up their act, basically. They Christianized what they were arguing. So if you read the text today in modern translations, you realize that the older translations that are usually the ones that are free, by the way, because of copyright, right? Newer translations you have to go buy, right? So Plato is free, and many of the older translations are certainly free, but the newer ones, which are a little bit more accurate, well, those you have to still spend money for one way or the other, right? Because of copyright rules. But when you look at the difference, one of the things that we think of regarding love is we think of platonic love, right? A platonic relationship. What do you think of, what is the main characteristic of a platonic relationship? Ever heard of it? Yes?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be sex-free, right? So the idea is you have a friend, a friendship, a love relationship with a person, but there's no sex involved in that. My suspicion is that this resulted from translations of the Symposium, where Socrates and his friends are all gathered around a typical symposium, and the topic is love. What is love? And they come up with 7 different varieties or interpretations of love. And in modern translations of it, it's pretty clear that when they talk about sexual love, they're talking about the love affair or relationship between the mentors and the mentees. And that's the older men and the young boys that they are mentoring. And that's kind of un-Christian in at least the English sense of the 1590s, etc. A little bit controversial, of course, still today. Always makes me feel a little squeamish when someone says, "Oh, you're so-and-so's mentor." I'm like, I'm not sure I really want to get into what that might imply, etc. But as we know today, there was love involved in that. The early translators hid that from their tutees, right? And as a result, it was, I think, something that people got the impression that when Socrates was talking about love in the Platonic dialogues, they weren't talking about erotic sexual love, but instead something much more abstract, like friendship. But today we know, no, that's not the case. So it seems odd to refer to something as a platonic relationship when you know, well, but that's not really what Plato was describing. So lots of fun in translation. By the way, if you're interested in translation as a difficulty, great book is that a fish in your ear? As you can imagine just from the title, is that a fish in your ear? Odd sort of question, but that's hilarious. All sorts of problems that occur because of problems in translation. By the way, I would go along with Willard Van Orman Quine and his conclusion that all translation is a lie. There's no real accurate way of translating from one language to another. And by the way, that actually applies to meaning in our own language, so that when I say something and you say something, we like to think we're understanding one another, and certainly to a certain extent we are. On the other hand, if we were like computers and trying to be absolutely exact, we wouldn't be. We're not even close, probably, right? So it depends on the relative circumstances, what you're looking for, whether we understand one another or not. Lost my place. So, when I emailed you, or is everyone getting the emails I send through Blackboard? I also post them as a announcement. Yes? Making sense? Okay. Is that a good? I used to post things on my blog, but that was a whole lot of extra effort. Oddly, it doesn't seem like it should be, but I had to use a special computer to do it. Mostly because I don't remember the password, but that computer does, so I have to use that one. In any case, instead of putting the quiz question and the links to the videos on the blog, I've been just instead putting the links to the videos in my emails announcements to Blackboard. Does that work?
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. And I'm not going back over what the question was. I figure, well, you'll find it when you're watching the video if you missed it in class. Does that make sense? Okay. So Susan Wolf, The Meaning of Lives. Actually brought the book. Does anybody else have it? No. So everybody reads at home and doesn't bring it. Oh, there's a couple copies. You notice, by the way, on the back cover? Yes? You noticed? That was just fun. Pardon?
I bought the books on the text classes. I just started cutting pages out.
You cut the pages out? Okay. I still have textbooks from 1970. I don't think I have any of the textbooks from 1969 when I started college, but I do have, once I switched to being a philosophy major. Remember, I was a music major and discovered I didn't have any talent, so I switched to philosophy. And once I switched to philosophy, I started saving all my textbooks. So The Meaning of Lives. Now, Susan Wolf's teacher is someone that we're also going to get to read, and that's Thomas Nagel, who's still out and teaching. And the most famous thing that Thomas Nagel wrote about was, what is it like to be a bat? Imagine trying to be a bat. That's actually an article, another one that we're going to look at. And you think, whoa, that's pretty weird. But the issue that he's trying to get at, and the issue that comes up in this article by Susan Wolf, who was he was her PhD thesis moderator, advisor, concerns solipsism. So strictly speaking, what is solipsism? Anybody? Are we all solipsistic? The self is all that can be known to exist. The problem here is, thanks to David Hume, who died in 1776, which is an easy year to remember because that was such a great year for Pinot Noir. I'm sure you all remember it, 1776. David Hume famously took the British empiricist's point of view to its extreme, which basically was that the only thing we can know for sure is what we're actually experiencing, right? So I'm seeing the auditorium, I'm seeing the pink hat with the moose on it that says Alaska, etc. So those are things that I see and that I know for sure, right? So that's what the British empiricists were thinking, that the only thing you knew for sure is what you were actually seeing. It's kind of like the one state that says, show me, right? Is that Missouri? I think the show me state? Or is it Idaho? Which state is it? Missouri? Okay. So I did basic training in the state of Missouri, so I think of it as misery. that sense, but that's different. Fort Leonard Wood, also known as Lost in the Woods, if you're from there. So solipsism is the idea that when you get right down to it, the only thing that I can possibly know for sure is what I'm experiencing at the moment. And the problem is I can't even know if what I'm experiencing is something that's real out there. I don't have any way of bridging that gap from being, yes.
So it's like the thing where people, non-believers are like, how do you know there's a God out there? It's like someone like that. Like you can't prove that there's a God.
Well, I would argue that you could.
Oh.
But it's not the same sort of thing, because I'm not looking for an empirical experience of God. Instead, it's like math. 1 + 1 = 2. We know that for sure, right? Yes? Yeah. Why? Well, because you're not allowed to think otherwise. Mom will smack you if you think 1 + 1 = 3, right? No, so it's against the rules. Math is absolute, right? That's kind of neat about it. But notice that math is not empirical. It's not dependent on our experience for us to learn the rules of mathematics. It's instead a matter of learning mathematics, right? You have to learn mathematics. When we think of God since roughly the 1100s AD, the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be thought or conceived, either way, right? And that comes from St. Anselm. Let me see if I can show you where that is. And it's referred to as the ontological argument. Ontos is thing, logical, what follows from the definition of the thing, basically. So if God, by definition, is that than which nothing greater can be thought, and we accept that definition, and if you're a theologian, you do, then, by definition, God must exist, because if God does not exist, anything else that exists is greater than God, which is a contradiction. So you see, by definition, God is the only necessary being, by definition. So God must exist. Of course, the problem after that is demonstrating, well, what other characteristics might God have? And that's, of course, an empirical problem. And so there's no agreement on anything other than that God, by necessity, a logical necessity, must exist. In fact, we could turn that around and look at Susan Wolf's situation, because she is looking at things from Thomas Nagel's instruction and thinking primarily in terms of this analytic analysis type of philosophy. And if you're doing that, you're looking for very concrete meanings in the statements that you're making. You want to be able to see the evidence that the statement is true. And if you cannot see such evidence, then you're left wondering, well, could it be false, right? So we want concrete evidence to know whether a statement is true or false. And the thing, oh, you know why it's not working? How many of you think it would be a good idea if I plug the speakers in?
Nah. Not really. That's probably a horrible idea.
This could be really bad. Be careful, hold your ears. I'll turn it down. How about now?
There we go.
Shoot. I'll start all over again. So the quiz question, no, I'm just kidding. I won't start all over. So Thomas Nagel and the British analytic movement wants our statements to be very precise, very clear. Very interesting history of that. We'll talk about some of that. Wittgenstein will be part of that. But when we're dealing with things like that's a camera, everyone agrees that's a camera, is that a good camera? We're not going to agree on that. We're going to have different interpretations over whether or not it's a good camera or not. And so the kinds of statements that the British analytic effort, and it wasn't just British, it's also American, was focused on were the kinds of statements that literally no one could disagree with. We saw it, we know it for sure, it's true. It's very much like David Hume was pretty much saying, you have to be able to see it to know it's true, right? And it gets worse, of course, because what if I'm not looking at the camera? Is the camera there? Are you there? Am I solipsistic? Is the only thing that I'm possibly aware of what's going on in my own sensory apparatus inside my own brain, right? So if I'm psychotic, for example, and I'm seeing Abraham Lincoln walking across the stage to give his Gettysburg Address, if I'm really seeing him, I'm absolutely convinced he's there, even if none of the rest of you are seeing him. And so at that point, you feel like, well, I need help, right? Because I'm seeing things that no one else is, right? Well, the trouble, of course, with the solipsist is that you have no way of getting outside of your own head to know if what you're experiencing is shared by other people or not. By the way, today, I think a much better answer to this is that we have a sociological self, a sociological cogito, so to speak. And that comes from Descartes' cogito ergo sum, which basically says in Latin, I think, therefore I am, right? And Descartes argued that that proved that the self exists, but as a thinking thing. It was solipsistic. He was trapped in himself, in his own mind. He didn't know that he could get out of it, right? But today we would argue that you cannot have a private language. You cannot have those kinds of cognitive thoughts in sentences unless there's a language that you share with other people. And so if you're thinking cogito, ergo, sum, I am, right? It has to be the case that when I think, we are. Because I have to have other fluent speakers of the language that I'm thinking in that help me have my language, have my meaning. How did I learn my meaning? The words mean what I learn. I'm using it, when I'm speaking and you don't look confused, I realize, aha, you understood me, then I use the words correctly, and so with that feedback, I gradually learn to become a fluent speaker. So therefore, I can think in that language. It definitely means that we exist. It's not just me, right? We even would say that I am as I see others see me, right? So that my self-concept is really not just what I think of myself, but what I think of myself based on my relationship with others. But when we get back to the meaning of lives and the way Susan Wolf critiques the kinds of statements, the meta-narratives, the stories that we use traditionally to explain meaning in life, it turns out that those stories cannot satisfy that criteria of having an empirical verification. Because you're essentially talking about theories, Love, I'm trying to remember the quote that everyone used yesterday for Martin Luther King. Love is what? I forget. It was even in the cartoon, and I can't remember it. Love is like the strongest force in the universe, or I forget how it goes, right? Well, that's not something that you can empirically verify, right? You can't say that the love you express to your children and your friends and so on is, you know, the best thing you can do, etc. I mean, you could look at the main thesis in Harry Potter movies, for example. It's Harry against Voldemort. And what's the main difference between them? Voldemort doesn't love, Harry does, right? And Harry's not the only one. He has friends. Actually, Voldemort has some friends too, but you know, they're not really very good friends, basically, because he just wants to kill everybody, unless they, whatever, right? So when you look at the basic plot between, you know, Harry and Voldemort, it's a matter of love, etc. Right? Harry's mother loved him, right? And if we go and look at even did I get the right one? Lily's theme? No, well, maybe. Commercial. How many of you are familiar with the movies about Harry Potter? Two? Two of you? Three? Ooh, more of you. This is the actual whole soundtrack, isn't it? I'll skip it. Well, you know Harry's mother is named Lily, yes? Which is short for Lilith. How many of you are familiar with the character Lilith, who was predecessor of Eve in the garden? But she was bad. She didn't behave herself. So God replaced her with Eve. Yes? You familiar with that? No? It's kind of interesting. Lilith. Of course, I've had other people say, no, Lily is not Lilith, etc. So that's certainly an interpretation. So in that sense, Lilith is the female, whatever you want to call it, fighting against the obvious maleness of Voldemort, who just wants to destroy stuff. So kind of an interesting. Well, I'll skip this, unless you like it in the background. We can do that. So where am I? Okay. So one of the things that irritates me with the conclusions that Susan Wolf makes is that religion is no longer something that anybody believes in anymore, right? Well, Eddie Glaude, if you watch the video, he had some concerns with that. He also talked about American pragmatism, which is his specialty, but Eddie Glaude has, in his own background, a lot of experience from the Black Baptist Church, and when he speaks, he often uses that same kind of oration that you typically get to associate with people who have had that kind of training. It's absolutely fantastic. And of course, he comes to bat concerning the importance of religion. Oddly, it also brings up the Sisyphus, familiar with the story of the Sisyphus. He's condemned to basically pushing that rock up the hill, and then as soon as it gets up there, it rolls right back down, and he has to push it back up. Basically, it sounds like most jobs that people get today. Right? And so if Sisyphus can't feel good about what he's doing, I think that's kind of interesting. Can he have a sense of purpose in pushing that rock up the mountain and letting it roll back down again, and then just doing it again, knowing full well that it's going to roll right back down again? But can he keep at it constantly and feel good about himself? Can you work in a factory? I remember when I first graduated with my BA, that summer I got a job in a tar factory where I helped fill cans of tar and put lids. We had a whole crew, we rotated positions, but basically that's all you were doing is just filling the cans, putting the lid, putting the label, putting it on the pallet. That's just, for 4 months I did that. Good money though, very good money. I think it was something like $3.25 an hour, so that was pretty good back then. In any case, though, it was so boring, I kept nodding off, which was not very good because the rest of the crew were Puerto Rican, and they spoke no English, and the Spanish they spoke used knives as emphasis. And so if I started to nod off and I made a mess, the knives came out to add emphasis to their disgruntlement with my behavior. So I remember that experience, and I remember just how difficult it was to do something that routine without something to help you distract your mind that didn't at the same time cause accidents in what you were doing. Very difficult. Very difficult. In a sense, I thought I was pretty well ruined by my education, my BA so far, because I would be thinking about other things instead of concentrating on making sure each lid fit exactly in the can, right? That's very much like Sisyphus, just at least I got to go home and have dinner and stuff like that, but otherwise, it was a very boring routine, and it was just going to be more of the same the next day, etc. I was clearly an alienation from me and my work, and that's certainly something that Marx talks about, right? The problem with capitalism, one of the problems is that the workers, of course, are being abused by just constantly made to work as fast as possible, etc. So can we have meaningfulness in our lives by simply saying, this is what I love doing? So if Sisyphus literally enjoyed rolling the rock, and he thought so that rolling this rock was so important, that it would give him a sense of purpose. Does that seem to work? It doesn't really seem that way. I think there was also the suggestion that maybe if he had something in his bloodstream that gave him the feeling that he was happy, even if he wasn't. So opiates of some sort, I suppose, would work. Then you could be drugged into thinking that you were having a good time, even though you were just rolling that rock up the hill. I don't know. So, but when we look at the argument over religion and the meaning of life, I, number one, don't think she's right in saying that it's not a worthwhile question. She's probably right that we can't test any of those moral narratives, those meta-narratives, by some sort of empirical means to see if the meaning in your narrative is true. But at the same time, it certainly has an impact on individuals. We might even be able to do a sociological study and find out which meta-narratives, which religions, for example, have the best results. Now, we might, of course, argue over what kind of results we consider to be best. In fact, we certainly would do that. Some religions, for example, feel like happiness is not something that's important. In fact, the more happiness you have, the more evil, right? So being happy is not what life is all about. You should be suffering. That's the important part of life. Remember, because we want your soul to be free from the attachment to this earth, right? So instead of being happy, you should be suffering. And yet many today would argue that the most important characteristic of life that we should be shooting for is that life should be happy. We associate this with utilitarianism, a British philosophy that goes very much with David Hume, with John Stuart Mill, that the real goal of everything we do ought to be happiness, and not just happiness for ourselves, but happiness for the greater number. All right, so it's called the principle of utility, that the greatest happiness for the greatest number is what we should use as our measurement on how we should decide moral difficulties, right? Which decision is going to result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? I don't know how that would work out, but I know that there are groups that meet to try to decide which religions are the kind that ought to be legal and which kinds of religions ought to be banned because of the way they imperil general happiness, etc. So that's kind of interesting. Okay. So I'll finish with that. We have our quiz question, yes, everybody? Does your meaning in life help you interpret art? I think I phrased it a lot better the first time, but you get the idea. Okay. So for next class, remember to read Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? It's page 300 to 309 in your text. And this is actually Thomas Nagel in the video that I have. And I don't know, do you think he looks like a bat? He looks bat-like, doesn't he?
She doesn't like it.
No, I like her. I like the part where Socrates was questioning Hubert Thoreau, and he was like, are the gods pious and pious, or is the pious God pious?
It wasn't the guy pushing the rock in the Hades. He already died, though. It's just a truth. And he felt in his head.
Just concentrate on the word. Just doing the same thing over and over again, especially when it has no effect. A lot of jobs are miserable like that, but you eventually get up to a pyramid. But when it's totally wasted, constantly Greek class expression of plug-in speakers. There's so many different things to remember.
There's